Greetings everyone, and welcome to this Data Platform Summit 2020 session of the Cross-Platform Management and Fun with PowerShell, the WSL, and Windows Terminal. My name is Mike Nelson. I am a Solutions Architect on the Microsoft Solutions team at Pure Storage. I am also a Microsoft MVP, a vExpert, a Citrix CTA, and a Microsoft Azure Advisor. You can always reach me on Twitter at MikeNelsonIO, or on GitHub. You can check out my presentations and some code that I've written out at MikeNelson-io. So what I want to jump into here is a session around not only the WSL and Windows Terminal, but also the third part that ties them kind of together, which is PowerShell. And I'm going to focus mainly on the slides that are going to be around the WSL, because I really want to show you Windows Terminal. I want to show you everything about it and get real examples in there. And then I'm going to bring in the WSL, kind of blend the two together and kind of bring it all together with PowerShell, using PowerShell in both examples, going between Linux and Windows, and so on and so forth. So that's the agenda I have. It's pretty much not something I've written down, but you can see here I'm going to focus on these aspects like I mentioned. Windows Terminal plus the Windows subsystem for Linux, and to tie it all together, we'll have PowerShell. All right, so let's get started with the WSL first of all. So WSL version 1. If you're not familiar, there was a version 1 of WSL, and when it came out, it was more of something they were trying to experiment with, if you will. They were really trying to use Docker and using virtual machine to run the Linux distribution. Now, Microsoft hadn't developed its own kernel at that time, and if you look at it, it used the NT kernel, which is part of Windows Server still, believe it or not, and they run the WSL on top of that, and then the Linux distributions actually run on top of that. Okay, so you have a stack going on there, right? It was in August 2016, it was Ubuntu only. That's the only distribution that they had out for it. In late 2017, they started to add Microsoft Store images, which included images such as, there was one out there called Penguin, Kali, and Debian came along, SUSE. Those all started to come in late 2017. Windows 10, which is version 1607 or above, and Server 2019, have the capability of running the WSL. Now, there is a little caveat with Server 2019, which I'll get to in a little while. But with Windows 10, 1607 or above, which I hope a lot of people are on, if you're not, you need to get to that version. And I have heard rumors that they may backport. They may go back a little bit. I don't know if that's true, but really you want to try and get up to the latest versions and keep up to date with the latest of the WSL. It had a Linux compatible kernel with the GNU. Okay, so it was really limited. It was a compatible kernel, but functionality wise and even speed wise, it had quite a bit of limitations. It had a huge somewhat of overhead on the Windows 10 machine itself when it would run in CPU cycles and RAM. So with WSL v2, you'll see the differences here in a little bit. And it could not scale. Like I mentioned before, you're running a stack, right? And the WSL just could not scale. If you started to run too much inside of the WSL, it would really start to get bottlenecked, really get, start to get strained, and it would cause your Windows 10, your Windows host machine to really start slowing down as well. And finally, the WSL had no systemd. There's no binaries could be run. It was really trying to emulate, and it wasn't doing that great of a job. It did good though. I mean, it was something that you could manage. It was something that you could utilize for basic management functionality, but nothing really expansive, right? Nothing that you could really, dig your teeth into. And then come along with WSL v2. And this is just so far because they're just constantly expanding it. It is out on GitHub, so there's, people that are helping develop it. And really, it's really progressing extremely well. So if you look at the difference in architecture, it's quite evident, right? Because you have a hypervisor You have the NT kernel and the user mode on the left-hand side there. And the right-hand side, you're doing the Linux kernel. Okay, but see, the Windows user mode and the Linux user mode are sharing. Okay, they're actually cross-platform there. And it's using a lightweight Linux utility VM. It's not that big one they used to have for V1. It's actually a smaller, lightweight one that doesn't even show up in the Hyper-V Client Manager any longer, which I'll show you in the demonstrations. But you'll see that it all runs on top of that hypervisor layer. But it's not the Hyper-V. It is Hyper-V, but it's not. Okay, and I'll explain that a little bit when we get into the demonstrations. So from bullet points, it's no longer emulating calls. It is using a Type 1 lightweight hypervisor. It's running a single VM with ext4 file system, extended 4 file system VHD. It is one kernel running multiple distros. That's kind of important. You've got one kernel that's running multiple distributions of Linux. And that is, allowing for greater scalability than you could have when you're talking about being able to stack processes on top of each other and run them side by side. Independent IPs is kind of big because previously you always had to go into the distribution and you had to use the host IP, right? Or do a local host or something like that. Independent IPs, you can actually assign an independent IP to each individual distribution, which is really, really cool when you're trying to, run web apps or troubleshoot or something like that. It has a new Docker backend. Now, this isn't really new. It's been around since WSL 2 got introduced, but it's really kind of cool. I'll show you in the demonstration how Docker actually integrates directly with the WSL V2. And when you install Docker Desktop in Windows 10, it comes up and it says, hey, whoa, you're running WSL. You want us to, jive together? You want us to work together? Then cool, we'll do that. And I'll show that to you. It uses a host file system, which is accessible via if you're really nerdy into file systems, it was a 9P protocol where everything is a file, just like Linux, everything is a file. But that was developed a long time ago by Bell Labs. And it uses the 9P protocol, which is very fast and very efficient. And it also uses what they call the IFS network director for Linux for the file access, which is also very fast and very efficient. So from a V2 overall architecture, this is what you're looking at. You're looking at, and I'm not going to go through this whole thing, but if you take a look at the core components, okay, you have the Windows files, local disk C on the left-hand side. You'll notice how that all interoperates into the VM, okay, and then back all the way down to Linux files, explorer.exe. So everything kind of ties together and everything can talk to each other. Now, that doesn't mean that it's all rosy and everything's cool. And, there are little caveats and there are issues with permissions and working with individual files because, Linux and Windows have a history of not really getting along with each other. Well, they're still working out those, uncomfortable, we don't get along type components. But they did a fantastic job so far of being able to merge and being able to utilize the functionality from both operating systems, and you'll see that. So doing a quick version compare, if you're looking at WSL V1 and V2, you'll notice right down the line, right? Everything is cool until you get to a managed VM. Because WSL V1, like I said, uses a managed VM, 2 does not. 1 does not have the full Linux kernel, 2 does. And 1 cannot do full system call, but 2 can. All right, that doesn't mean it can do full system D, but it can do full system call. All right, there's a difference between the two. And then performance across OS file systems. You'll notice that WSL2 falls, okay, and WSL V1 actually is better at that. That's why they say, hey, if you are really need that performance across both file systems, you might want to stick with V1. Why is that? Because it's using a dedicated VM, a fat VM that allows for those file systems to actually increase the speed when you're doing copies and doing other transactional operations across them. Where WSL v2 isn't there yet. They want to get there, and they plan to get there. You can see it out on GitHub that they're really driving towards that. But for now, they even say, hey, if you want that, maybe you want to stick with WSL v1. So, a work in progress. These are the WSL feature availabilities that are out there. And I do want to pause here for a second and thank a gentleman that has created a massive amount of content out there. His name is Patrick Wu. He is awesome at WSL. Him and another gentleman who's awesome at it, Hayden Barnes. They are just fantastic, people to talk to and get to know, and then also look at what they've created, because they really focus a lot around the WSL. They're both Linux guys. So if you want to take a look at their stuff, it's really good. And I credit Patrick, because I took this information. I wasn't going to reinvent the wheel here. So you can take a look here at the feature availability between the builds of Windows 10. And when you get to 2004, you'll notice, all the check marks are there. You might have some certain conditions, certain features and functions, and then even kept because of backward compatibility, WSL config and bash.exe. It's when you look at the progression, they really are increasing. And now when we go past 2004, you're going to see even more integration. You're going to see everything much tighter. You're going to see really cool stuff like being able to do graphics and stuff like that. It's going to be awesome. So why would you want to use the WSL? I've had a lot of people that have, when I start talking about the WSL and running Linux, inside of Windows, they're asking me, why would I want to do that? And I have to tell you that a lot of the questions that I get around that are from folks who have been doing administration or working with Linux or working with Windows for a very long time. When I talk to younger students about this, they embrace it. They're just like, oh, this is so cool. I can do this and I can do that and I can do this and I can do that. But some folks that have been around for a while in IT, they're kind of maybe, I'm not going to say they're stuck on their ways, but there are some things where they just feel that they can do it quicker than, switching to another operating system. I totally get that. And I agree with that to a point. But I think you also have to, lend yourself to be able to, do more efficiently and do more automated, which the WSL really kind of accelerates that. So why pick the WSL? Well, you were raised on Unix, right? Linux or Unix, like I was, that's the first thing I did was run a Unix machine. That was my first job in IT. You work on appliances. Appliances are pretty much all Linux-based. I mean, you might have some Windows-based ones, but, usually they're all Linux-based or, hardened Linux-based. You cross-develop. What's key now? Well, I can download an app for Windows. I should be able to download it for Linux, and I should be able to download it for Mac. Well, Mac is Linux. It's a variation of Darwin and whatever. But, you want that ability to be able to develop an application and then be able to port it, and easily cross-develop, easily debug, easily troubleshoot. Working with Docker containers and Kubernetes, K8s, K3s, this is the new buzzwords, right? Kubernetes everywhere. When you want to work with Docker containers and Kubernetes, this makes it really easy, because you can do it in multiple OS environments. And as you know, you can run Windows containers and you can run Linux containers. So, there is a bit of flexibility there. Flexible automation and administration, obviously, all right, because you have both operating systems. If you know Linux command line, there's a lot of little utilities and stuff like that hidden inside of Linux that Windows doesn't have. And with Windows, you don't necessarily have to open a GUI prompt, right? You can use PowerShell, but you can also use PowerShell inside of Linux now. So, again, cross-platform. VMs, optional, Hey, why do I want to spin up a Linux VM just to do this one thing? Why don't I just start the WSL and run that Linux and do that task or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 that I have to do, and then I'm done with it. I close it out, I'm gone. There's really no reason to take the time, spin up a Linux VM, clone it, do whatever, blah, blah, blah. WSL just makes it easier. And it's fun to play with. I can attest to that. It's a lot of fun to play with. So we'll take a look at some of that fun stuff in the demo. So developing WSL. If you're a developer, obviously you can do Visual Studio Code. You can do it remote with the WSL. Visual Studio Code goes across platform. Even if you're doing, editing and code from other Linux editors, Atom, Sublime, Text3, any Linux editor, you can use that cross-platform. There are a couple that are actually used cross-platform in Windows that can be done as well. And I know that a really popular one that a lot of folks like to use is called Notepad++. They're actually working on that. They're actually, I heard rumblings and rumors that they're contemplating making that cross-platform editor, which is really going to be kind of cool. But I use Visual Studio Code, and Visual Studio Code rocks. I mean, it's so easy to use. And you can use it cross-platform, and it's simple command line, or it's visual, whatever you like. But that is my preference. You may have your own. And then finally, if your project does require cross-compilation using both Windows and Linux tools on the same files, it says use WSL v1 for now. Again, we're talking about the OS performance of WSL v1 in relation to files. And another thing is that when you start getting into file locking, okay, so when you're in Windows and you're editing a Linux file inside of WSL, and you go change a file there, and then you have code open in Linux and you're editing the file there, you're dealing with a file locking contention, okay? And they're saying if you want to do that, that really works better in WSL v1 than it does in v2. Hopefully you're not doing that though, but you might be. What about Docker? Docker desktop install with v2. This is the banner you get when it comes up and it says, hey, you got v2. We would really like to provide you better performance, with your WSL2 distros. Will you allow us to do that? And of course, you say yes. This is what it looks like from a Docker perspective. When Docker looks into the WSL and it controls into what it's doing from a life cycle in Docker Dieg, Kubernetes. Because as you know, and if you don't know this, Docker for desktop can now do Kubernetes. Okay. So if you're interested in that, you just load Docker Desktop and tell it to start Kubernetes. But this architecture, I'm not going to get too deep in, because if you don't use Docker, then you probably don't have any interest in this. But I use Docker quite a bit just because I like to spin things up and then throw them away. So it's really kind of easy that way. And then you have Kubernetes. Okay, this is an actual Kubernetes that's running inside of WSL. So you can see here, this is K8. It's actually running a Kubernetes pod, and it's running an app out of Kubernetes. So this is really kind of cool, and this is all utilizing the WSL to do this. All right, some important things to know. You really want to know about permissions. Permissions are different between Linux and Windows. You need to understand when you have a file in Windows and you copy it over to Linux, what gets inherited, what doesn't. Same thing, vice versa. Paths, okay? Remember, Windows, you actually use that little backslash, right? Linux likes to use a /. But also, Linux is very case sensitive. Linux just has, it's part of the kernel, it's part of the language that grew up with Linux, is that you make sure that you have the right case when you're typing something. And Linux will bark at you every time if you miss it. Windows could care less, right? So case is big when you're dealing with the Linux side if you haven't worked with it before. Something called WSL path. This allows for path mapping between Windows and Linux, and I'll show that in the demonstration. WSL config. This is where you can actually set the defaults for all of your WSL distributions out of the box. When you actually download a distribution and you launch it in WSL, this file sits inside of your user home directory on the Windows side and controls certain aspects of each distribution that you're going to run. Now, there is a partner to that too, which is in the Linux file system called the etcwsl.conf file. But that doesn't contain all of the same settings that WSL config has. And I'll go over that briefly as well. It's really kind of important that the WSL conf file inside of Linux is really if you're going to take those distributions and you're going to share them. because one of the key things, and one of the bullet points that's coming up, is that you can create custom distributions that WSL will run. So if you have a custom Linux distribution that your company works with or that the developers work with, you can run it inside of WSL. It's pretty cool. WSL ENB, okay? As of build 17063, you need to know that WSL ENB really deals with the environment variables that work between Windows and Linux. If you're working with an application that requires, environment variables to be stated, you're going to have to understand WSL ENB and how you can set those variables to go cross-platform. A server install is different, okay? You can enable it the same way inside of Server 2019, but you can't install. There's no store that's available. There's no Microsoft Store that's available in Server 2019. Now, that's not to say it may not be available in future versions of Windows Server, but for now, what you have to do is use a command line to actually get the distributions into the WSL. So it's a little hokey, but very doable. The LXSS Manager is the service you're looking for. So anything that's running on WSL is running under this service. Whenever you have to restart the WSL, you can use the command line. But if you, for some reason, can't get to the command line, you can't manage it from command line, you can always stop and restart this service. And there is a WSL command line that you can use that contains many different options, not only for stopping and starting and setting distributions and default distributions and versions of distributions, but also allows you to import and export different distributions, which is kind of cool. HCS Dieg. Now this is what I'm going to show you. The HCS Dieg is around exactly what is happening with that little lightweight VM that's running. There's only a couple commands. It's very well hidden, very well protected. But I'm going to show you a couple HCS Dieg commands when we do the demonstration. Custom distros. There is a Microsoft kernel that's available. It's out open source. It's out on GitHub. You can actually take that Microsoft kernel. You can modify it. You can do whatever according to the license. But you can also do custom kernels. You can take distros like Ubuntu. You can modify it, make it your own, as they call it, roll your own, and then be able to utilize that to distribute to other developers, to other people, to customers, to whatever. But you have that capability to create customs and load them inside of the WSL. And then finally, another really kind of cool utility function called the WSL Utils. There's also something called the PSUWI, but these are utilities that were created out on the internet under open source. Patrick Wu was part of it. But I'm going to show you a couple of those because they're really kind of cool if you're trying to do some stuff with WSL. So finally, here's a list of resources that I've compiled. It's by nowhere near complete. There are literally hundreds of resources out there. Actually, out on GitHub, there's one called the Awesome WSL list. If you ever want to go out and take a look at that, you see Aidan Barnes has it right there. That actually is really cool because it lists all the different resources you have for WSL. Really, really good stuff if you're interested in that. So without further ado, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the demos. And these demos are going to take a little while, so I'd like to kind of follow up with the supporting slides first before I exit to those. These are the ones that are coming from the data platform folks. So special thanks to Microsoft for supporting it. I really appreciate that. I really appreciate being able to present. And thank you. They're telling you there's a couple different ways to win prizes here. I hope everybody wins. I know everybody can't win, but I can't win, but I hope everybody else does. So without further ado, I am going to slide into the demos. So to start off the demos, what I'd like to do is I'm going to be covering the WSL and Windows Terminal and then adding a bit of PowerShell interoperability in as well. Now, I won't be able to show everything. I'm going to try and show quite a bit. And I may go at a pretty good pace. So you have the advantage of being recording, being able to, fast forward, reverse, as you need to reference anything. So let's just dive right into it. First, I'm showing you the Windows command line blog. It's a great point of reference for everything dealing with the Windows terminal and the WSL, along with any other command lines. Good tips and tricks, good information about different releases, even previews, so on and so forth. So to start off, I'm going to introduce the Windows terminal. If you don't have it installed, there are a couple different ways that you can install the Windows terminal. The easiest way and the recommended from Microsoft is to install it from the Windows Store. So if you open up your Windows Store and you do a search and you just type in terminal, you're going to see a couple apps come up, and the ones that you're really interested in here is the Windows Terminal and the Windows Terminal Preview. I like to use the Preview for the simple fact that bleeding edge, get to use some new features and things like that aren't in the stable version. If you feel more comfortable with the stable, then you can use that as well. Now, you can install it that way. You can also install it using a couple different package managers. If you're familiar with like Chocolatey or Scoop or Winget, anything like that, you can definitely install it that way as well. You can even install it, directly from GitHub. So a bunch of different ways you can install Windows Terminal into Windows 10, and whichever way you feel comfortable with. So once you have it installed, you will get an icon that in your start menu. You can also start it. I'm going to start up a command prompt here. You can start it right from the command prompt by typing WT. So obviously this will not start the preview. This will start the stable version. So if you just type WT, it starts up like that. All right. You get an icon for the preview version. If you want to start it that way, it'll come up, and I've pre-started one with a bunch of tabs open. But this is the Windows Terminal. So as you can see, it's a tabular type interface, and just a brief introduction to it. It does allow for quite a bit of customization on the back end. Like I mentioned, it's a tabular type interface, and it does have some really focused around keyboard shortcuts. So it's like Visual Studio Code or ADS, Azure Data Studio. They really focus around keyboard shortcuts, and this is no exception. So if you look at it, you have your tabs across the top. You're asking, how do I get those tabs? You can just click the plus key, and it'll keep generating tabs for you based off the last tab that was used. And you can hit the down arrow here, and this is a listing of all the available profiles, as they call them, or I like to call them sessions, that you can use inside of Terminal. Now, some of those are actually created by Windows Terminal when it's installed, and some you can create on your own. So we'll step through that a little bit as well. Whenever you install Windows Terminal, it goes out and it kind of scans for a couple different applications that may be installed, such as PowerShell, such as different distributions in the WSL, and also whether or not you have access to Azure for Azure Cloud Shell. So those, it goes out and it scans for that, and it'll automatically put entries in that you can use. Now, it also, will do that every time that the terminal is launched. So if anything changes between your terminal launches, it'll pick that up and it will either put it in or it will remove it. So if I have something in there and then I've removed it, next time terminal launches, it'll be gone. I'll show an example of that. So one of the key things I want to show about the terminal window that they've added, which kind of coincides with the other applications like Visual Studio Code and ADS and a couple others that are coming from Microsoft, is something called the command palette. If you do a Control-Shift-P, this brings up all the different commands that you can run in Terminal and with the keyboard shortcuts. So anything that you'd like to do, creating new tabs, doing copy paste, opening settings file, scrolling up, scrolling down, anything that can be done, you can bring up in this box, but it's really focused on telling you what the keyboard shortcut is to do it. So what we're going to do is we're going to go right into the settings file, because that's the heart of the Windows Terminal. So if we go into here and we click on settings, this brings up a settings.json file. Now, they are creating a UI for adjusting the settings for Windows Terminal. They haven't gotten it yet. Maybe by the time this recording is published, it will be. But for now, it's a JSON file, and you need to go in and edit this file. When you download Windows Terminal, you do get a default amount of settings, a lot of global defaults and things like that. And whenever you want to edit this file or add something, you can always just hover over and it will give you the IntelliSense. It will give you the information about what the option does and what the actual values of the options are allowed. Okay, so we get to profiles. Profiles I talked about, I like to call them sessions. This is where it kind of highlights the different sessions that I'm allowed to launch. PowerShell 5, PowerShell 7. We get down here to the command.exe. We go into SSH. And then finally, we get down to the ones that were added automatically by terminal. And these are actual distributions that I have, okay, which I haven't created, a bunch of options for. These are the defaults. So it saw that I had a Debian WSL distribution installed. It said, I'm going to give you these 5 defaults and you'll be able to run it. Now, if you want to take it any further and change other things like, the color scheme or the font size or the font face or anything like that, then you need to go and edit this file and add those parameters to this particular profile. Now, one thing that should be noted is that anything that you do inside of the settings.json file is dynamic in terms of the Windows Terminal application is always scanning. It's almost like a notification. Whenever something changes, you save this file, Windows Terminal knows about it. Okay, so if I were to go in here and make a syntax error, all right, so which is really easy to do in JSON, just by missing, as an example, I'm going to scroll up here a little bit. Just by missing a comma, all right? So I'm going to go and I'm going to say, okay, right after this snap-on input, I'm going to delete that comma. What that does is that invalidates the JSON file right there, okay? So if I click on File and then Save, if I go back, it's going to say, whoops, failed to reload settings, going back to defaults, because the line 23, column 17 is missing that comma, all right? Well, I can easily just go back in and know where that line is, enter that comma, click File, Save again, and that error goes away. Okay, and it picks up all the settings. So that's really kind of neat how it interacts, on that level. And when you change things, like if I wanted to change this command admin tab title, if I change it to admin 123, okay, and that was the title for it. If I click the save, Control S or save, and I go out here and I open up that command admin, okay, notice it says command admin 123. Go back in, take away the 123, click File, Save, go back, it's removed that 123. All right, so the settings file, there's just a bunch of settings that are applicable to everything from the profiles all the way down to if you go down here further, you get into the color schemes, all the different color schemes that you can put in. And then finally you get down to like hotkeys and all that kind of stuff. So it'll be really nice when they create the UI, because this is, it can be sorted a lot better, and it's more, better to do it visually than trying to sort through a JSON file. But for now, it's pretty easy to edit. So getting back to this, one of the features of the terminal today is you have the ability, like when I went in there and I renamed that tab, I can just do that on the fly too. I can right click on a tab and I can say rename tab. Or I can even change the color, which is really convenient, because when I'm working with a bunch of tabs and I want to understand what I'm actually flipping back and forth to, I can go in and change the colors. So I just know what color to go to. I don't have to worry about, trying to read the tabs or anything like that. from a Windows terminal perspective, I wanted to talk about what you can do from a tabular standpoint, what different profiles and settings or options are offered inside of the file, along with, some of the different customizations that you can do, how to start the Windows terminal, but then also the different sessions. If you saw, you can actually go and do things that were beyond just PowerShell and WSL and even SSH, right? Now, if you notice, one of the things I have here is I have something called admin. A lot of folks have a real hard problem trying to run, they have to run something as administrator, and then they have to back out and go in as a user. Or, you'll run something as a user, it'll come up and say, no, you have to run it as an admin. So what I've done is I've actually, there are a couple different ways around that. And what I've done is I've created a couple different command as admin, PowerShell as admin, PowerShell 5.1 as admin. And in the settings file, if you'll notice, it actually has a third-party command that you can search for out on GitHub, and it's called gsudo. Okay, so gsudo will actually elevate that command. And if you have, depending on what your elevation of privileges are, it should just elevate you, and it may prompt you for confirmation, and then you can just go ahead and execute what you need to execute inside of that terminal window. Now, after we got done talking about Windows Terminal and the layout and everything, one thing I did want to add as well is the panes, right? So what good is terminal? I mean, the tabular format is awesome, but you need to add panes. So if I go full screen here with this and I want to add another pane, I can do an Alt-Shift+, and it'll give me a horizontal or a vertical plane, right? If I do an Alt-Shift-, that'll give me a horizontal plane. All right, so in these different panes, I can be running different operating systems, running them all together. It's really, really helpful when you're doing a lot of cross-development between Linux and Windows, or even multiple PowerShell sessions like you see here. And you can just continually, increase these, to your heart's content until you run out of screen room, basically. But it really is helpful. And then we just do a Control-Shift-W to back them all out. So that is pretty much what I wanted to cover just on the Windows terminal, okay? Next, I'm going to jump into the WSL. Now, with the WSL, there are a couple different ways to do the installation. In Windows 10, by default, you can just go into Programs and Features, enable Windows features, and then enable the WSL. You can also install it from the Windows Store just by going to the Windows Store and searching for WSL. That'll allow you to install it as well. Now, there are a couple new different ways to do the installation, and I wanted to point these out because if you do any automation with PowerShell or with the command line, you're going to want to use these definitely more than using like a UI. And one is using the dism command. So if you use the dism command to install features, you can just go ahead and execute this. It'll enable the feature of the WSL. Now, if you join the Windows 10 Preview, Insider Preview program, which I highly recommend, when you install the latest builds, or you're in the beta or the development part of the Windows Insider, you can actually just do a WSL space -- install, and that will install the WSL subsystem for you. Pure and simple, not much involved there at all. Once it is actually installed, all you've really done is you've installed the subsystem. Okay, you haven't installed any distributions. Now what you can do is you can use this same command of WSL -install, and you'd be able to install a distribution. Now you're asking, how do I find out what distributions are available? Well, what you do is you could do a list command and then an online. And what that does is that tells you, hey, these are the distributions that are available that you can install. And it even gives you the information on how to install WSL -install -d and then the distribution name. Okay. Notice that these are, very limited. There are more that are available in the Windows Store, okay, and there are also more that are available if you just do a search on GitHub for distributions. There's quite a bit of folks that have created customs, and you may even create customs on your own. You know, your own distributions that you want to give to your people to test with, to do QA with, what have you. So that is just one way to do the installation. Now, it's really kind of important to see how this works, because there's only a couple ways to install distributions on Server 2019. So as I mentioned in the presentation, there's a caveat with Server 2019 is that you can install the WSL, but it doesn't have the Windows Store, right? It doesn't have that ability to download from there. So you either need to be on a insider build of Windows Server, or you need to do something, you know, that basically goes out and pulls a distribution like this command, where it's running a PowerShell command to invoke a web request. It goes out and pulls the Ubuntu 20.04 distribution image down to that server OS. There are a couple other ways to do it using like the add fx package command with PowerShell. You can search all that online, but you know, just like everything else, there's 5-10 different ways to do something, and it just depends on what, you know, process you want to use to be able to do it. All right, so once we've actually done that, we can do an installation. Now, I've already installed a couple of these, but I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to install a new one. I'm going to install that OpenSUSE. All right, so I'm going to go out and I'm going to say, okay, WSL, go ahead and install a distribution, and the name is going to be OpenSUSE 42. All right, it's going to go out, download that image. It's going to set it all up for me. It's going to basically come back after about maybe less than a minute and you know, tell me that it's ready to go. All right, that's how quick it is. Now, OpenSUSE is a little bit bigger distribution. If you were doing Ubuntu, this would take, you know, on average, for me, it takes about 10 seconds to set up a Ubuntu instance. There are other instances like Debian that, for me, actually go a little bit faster. Okay, so it's installing right now. As you can see, it's launching it. It's saying it may take a few minutes. It never has for me. And then it asks for a username. So I put in my username there, and it wants a password, a super secret, of course, password. I put that in there, and I put it in again. Okay, and password is up. Okay, use the same password for root. Yep, sure, why not? And boom, look at that. I have a Linux distribution that I am in that I can use. Very easy, very simple. Now that I've got that distribution actually there, I'm going to see an icon show up, you know, in my start menu. Okay, recently added. And I'm also going to see it show up here, but not until I restart Windows Terminal. If I started a new instance of Windows Terminal and I open that up, look at that. OpenSUSE 42. Automatically recognized it, automatically added it. If I click on that, it'll open that WSL instance and I can work in it. Now, it's still not going to show inside of this instance because I have not restarted it. All right. So, really simple to install, very easy to implement, and very quick. So what I want to do is go just step through a couple of the WSL utilities that are available with the WSL command line. If you just type WSL with a -- question mark, you can see all the options that are available, and we will step through a couple of these. So just to find out the status, first of all, this is kind of important. We do a WSL status. And what that does is that goes out and checks the kernel version for us. And that's kind of important because there was not too long ago, Windows 10 update that happened that kind of really messed with the WSL 2 kernel. And folks had to go out and actually download a kernel from GitHub in order to overcome some of the issues that they were having with that specific build of Windows 10. So this will go out, check, make sure the kernel is up to date. As you can see, okay, as it says, is that Automatic updates cannot occur, okay, because I don't have the receive updates for other Microsoft products when you update Windows option checked. Now, what does that tell you? That tells you that, number one, the WSL is no longer a second-class citizen inside of the Windows operating system. It is a first-class citizen because it is receiving updates along with the normally scheduled updates if you so opt to receive them. So that's kind of important, is that this is something that's here to stay. It's something that they're really investing a lot of time and effort into, and it's not just something that's going to be a preview and may not be there when the next version of Windows Server or Windows 10 or Windows whatever comes out. So it's always good to do a WSL status to make sure if it actually was, an update was available. You can just do a WSL -- update, and it would go through and update the kernel for you. Now, I don't know if people are aware of this. Is a quick little tip. There is a special folder that you can access called shell:\apps folder. All right, so if you type that in a run command, it's going to bring up all the apps that are installed on your machine, and even the ones that you can't, copy over to your desktop as a shortcut. All right, because Windows apps, when you get them through the Windows Store, you just can't right-click and copy them to the desktop. You have to go through a process to do that. So if you wanted to, you can go down, and I have a Ubuntu instance down here. I'm going to scroll down a little bit. Here's my Ubuntu. If I wanted to, I could just right-click on that and say Create Shortcut, and it'll create the shortcut to the desktop. So that's kind of a neat little tip there. So I want to show you something I talked about in the slide deck. It was something around the lightweight VM that WSL v2 uses. And it's a command that I mentioned called hcs-dieg. It's really not a Hyper-V thing, right? It is in the core, in the back end of it, but it actually is just running, kind of a virtual container, if you will. And I'm going to show you a couple of cool things if you want to really get nerdy about how the back end of WSL2 works. So the command you're going to run is something called hcs-dieg list. Now you have to run this as an admin. So I'm going to flip over to my admin one there. I'm going to put in the hcs-dieg list, and you can see I actually have two containers running there. One is a CM service, which is just a template. It's actually not a container that's running. And then the WSL is shown as running. Okay, so that is actually running. Now, what's interesting about this is I was curious as to, what else actually interacts with this. So what I did was I investigated a few of the apps within Windows 10, and one of them that I ran into is, I don't know if you're familiar with this one, but it's actually a sandbox. You can run a sandbox in Windows 10 if you enable this feature. So I'm going to launch a sandbox, and basically what a sandbox is it's an isolated raw version of Windows 10 that you can do things in, and then once you exit it, everything's destroyed. So if you wanted to test out an application, or you got an attachment from someone that you want to, you don't want your antivirus to catch, or you don't want to infect your network, you can open up a sandbox, and as you see, you get a full Windows 10. It's just that when you close it, it goes away. All right. And I was curious when I was running some of these applications, I'm like, what else runs as a container? So now that I have the sandbox open, if I go back here and I run this command again, look at that. There's a new container running called Madrid. That is the code word for Windows Sandbox. So expect to see more of these, because these are just really, quick, very lightweight containers, virtual containers that are running in Windows 10 that allow for, really interactive applications to run. So if you're interested in the sandbox, go out and investigate that. You can enable that directly in your programs and features, and just type Windows Sandbox and you'll be able to run it. All right, let's take a minute or two and talk about the configuration of the distributions. Now, I didn't mention in the presentation there's two different files that can kind of help you and control the distributions. And what I mean by that is there are certain settings that are put into these files that either affect all of the distributions as a global setting, or they affect each individual distribution. Under your user directory, you can put a file there. It's not there by default, but you can create a file called .wsl config. And I've got mine here. If I bring that up, you can actually go out and look at the website for the command line, and they give you an example of this file. But as you can see here, you can set, different parameters around the kernel, around memory, okay, how much to assign a VM, the WSL to, processors, swap files, even, port forwarding, things like that. And this affects all of the instances that you're running, okay, from a WSL standpoint. Now, it's important to know that this file changes quite a bit in terms of they add new features or they deprecate features. So if you're using this, you want to kind of keep on top of it, because it's not automatically updated, as far as I know, when you receive WSL updates. The other file that's actually individualized, that also does the settings for a particular distribution, is if you go into the etc directory of the distribution, there is a file, or you need to create a file called the WSL conf. And what that does is that actually has a couple different parameters as well that allows for like mounting of drives, working with networks, DNS, and interoperability, allowing Windows paths, stuff like that. The key is that the .wsl conf that's in your user directory on the Windows side is a global, right? These are individuals. These etc wsl.conf files belong in each distribution, and they can be different for each distribution. All right. So while we're on the topic, I kind of we're going to segue into this mounting aspect, is how Windows and Linux actually can share drives. Now, WSL has actually introduced a way to not only by default be able to map, into each other's operating systems by being able to just, go to a directory and see what's there. They've also added the ability to mount a drive, okay, on the WSL side, so you can actually share it amongst all the WSL distributions. So if you had some data files on it or something like that, you'd be able to mount it, and it would mount to all of the distributions, and you could interact with it. Very beneficial if you're working with data that you need to work cross-platform. So the first thing I'm going to show you is how they actually work together. Now, by native default, if you go into Explorer, okay, it actually has a Linux icon now. All right, and when you go there, you can see all of your distributions. And if you double click one, it'll go in and you can, see all the files. You can just about anything you can do in Explorer. You can copy files. You can, take a look at files. You can, move files, whatever. Now, you have to keep in mind that obviously you're working with a Linux file system. So, there might be changes in permissions and paths and things like that. But it's really convenient that you can just, click this and go. You'll notice up here it actually says WSL Debian. So if you type in just WSL with a $, that gives you the same thing. That's basically, that shortcut is doing the same thing as that WSL $. All right. So that's one way that you can see how to work with the file systems across both platforms. Another way to do it is when you're actually inside of one of the Linux distributions, you can just type Explorer. And if you put a period there, it's going to use the directory that you're in. Okay, actually explorer.exe, because it's Linux, it has to know the file extension. With a period, it'll launch the Explorer inside of that directory that you're in. Okay, so boom, I'm inside of there. I don't have to, click through and try and find the directory. It automatically brings me to that point. Very efficient. Now, moving on, I'm going to talk about mounting a drive. Okay, so right now, and I want to go back and see if I'm inside of one of these directories, and I'm just going to go into my Windows directory. I'm going to go into temp. if I actually do a shift right click, okay, you're going to see Open Linux Shell here. Okay, that actually allows you to run a Linux shell inside of whatever directory on the Windows side that you'd like to. All right, so just another quick tip, being able to right click, shift right click, I'm sorry, and then open Linux shell here, and it'll open up a bash shell for you from the WSL. So let's do a drive mount, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch over here. This is just to make sure this is my Debian. Yes, it is. So this is my Debian instance in WSL, and what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to rename that so I know that is Debian. See how easy that was? And what we need to do is I've got a drive that I created. So you just need to know that this is an actual, Linux ext4 file system on this disk, and you can't mount it in Windows. A regular BHD you'd be able to if it was NTFS or FAT32, but this has been converted to a Linux disk. All right, so what we need to do here is we need to go out, and in my PowerShell admin session, we need to mount this. And what I'm doing here is I've been doing a mount BHD, which is a PowerShell command, of that BHD drive. And I'm doing a get desk because I want to find out what number it is, and I'm putting it to a variable of A. So if I just type, out the variable of A, it's going to tell me that it's physical drive 4. Okay, so I need that for the next command. And since I made it a variable, it's pretty easy to use. So I just use a WSL with a mount command, and I do $A. All right, so it tells me it has been mounted. It's been mounted under the name physical drive 4. The mount point can be found under the path pointed to by the auto mount setting. The default is /mnt WSL. All right, so if I go out to, as an instance, my Debian instance, and I go to my mount WSL folder, and I do an ls-la, this is my physical drive 4. You can see it right there. So I go into my physical drive 4, and I created that text file out there, and that was my WSL test file.txt. Okay, so you can see that it's actually mounted, and I'm able to use that as a drive. Now, what's really kind of cool about this is that I can do this across all the WSL distributions, right, and share them. So when I want to actually unmount that and get rid of it, one thing I have to make sure is I'm not inside of that process. So I need to back out here. And once I back out, I do a unmount. All right. And then I actually need Hyper-V to do a dismount of that as well. So I'm going to do a dismount of that. So now it's totally dismounted. That disk is no longer available. All right, let's take a few moments here and talk about the interoperability with command lines between the two. All right, so I'm going to clear my screen here. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to run a command that will go out to two different distributions that I have on WSL. This command will say, it's saying, hey, WSL, go to the Debian instance and run a command called fortune. And pipe that, okay, again, WSL, go out to the Ubuntu instance and run a command called callsway. Now, these two commands are going to work together, and you're basically going to get this output, which is a fortune program that gives you, hey, kind of like a cookie fortune, okay, and WSL cow say it's a cow actually talking. So the point of showing this was that you can stack these. So I could take that WSL command line, pipe it to another WSL command, and keep piping it. Pipe, until you hit the number of characters that are allowed, 256 characters or whatever, that are allowed on the command line. So the amount of automation that you can do from a single command line is really, really kind of cool. It's pretty much, only limited to different factors of the operating system. Another one we can do is if we wanted to go out and find out like a string in a file. So I'm on the Windows side. I'm like, hey, what's that IP address of eth0 on my default instance of Ubuntu? It goes out and it says, oh yeah, it's 172.31.196.252. By the way, all right. So again, going from Windows, doing a find string over to the other distribution. You can create files this way. You can go out, if I wanted to find out what the time zone was and output that to a file from a particular distribution, you do that. Now, if we actually go in and we, do a cat on the tz.txt file, that's exactly what it put into that file. It was piped into there. And you can also do, run PowerShell commands stacked. So if you're running WSL and then you want to say, hey, okay, give me an ls-la, if you're not familiar with that, so it's like a directory listing with details, okay, and pipe that to the PowerShell command of select object, but only give me the first 10, okay, the top 10. Now, I'm running this and I don't have that many files in this directory that I'm running it from, WSL distros. But if it was a larger directory, you'd get the top 10. So you can see that you can run the commands, cross-platform. Let's touch on PowerShell specifically a little bit. I'm going to, again, clear my screen. Now, PowerShell, as you know, you can run PowerShell 7. I can also, launch a PowerShell 5.1 session, okay, because I have that installed. But as you know, PowerShell is now cross-platform and it's open source. So you can run PowerShell inside of a Linux distribution, not only WSL, but any, inside of a standard Linux distribution you're running on a physical machine or in a VM. So if you just type WSH, once you install it, that'll open up the PowerShell session and you are in Microsoft's PowerShell environment, if you will. So it's kind of important that the ability to do cross-platform with PowerShell is really key when you're working with different type of development and different type of testing, especially even from a management standpoint. Being able to cross-manage across platforms is really kind of cool, and running those commands together, it makes the possibilities endless when you're talking about being able to do administration and management. So one of the things I want to show from a PowerShell perspective is, even if you don't have PowerShell installed on a Linux instance, you can run it from WSL because it goes out and retrieves it from Windows. Okay, so as an example, Ubuntu has a window. If I were to exit out of this PowerShell and if I were to type that, it will actually go out and it'll execute the Windows PowerShell. Hope this works. Yep. So right now, this is actually executing PowerShell, okay, from the Windows side. And I can prove that by doing a PS version table. But you can see I'm on Linux and the PS version table comes up and tells me that my OS platform is Win32NT. Well, no, it's not. I'm running inside of Linux. Okay, so it's actually not. But I executed this because I didn't want to install Linux on the PowerShell on the Linux side, or I'm not able to do that. Well, then this proves that you can run it, through Windows into Linux. Because if I run PowerShell here again, this is the native PowerShell, right? PWSH, and I do a PS version table here. Notice it says my OS platform is Unix. You can also do cross. So if I wanted to, you can do a get process. It's the same thing. Just about anything you can do on the Windows side, you can do it on the Linux side as well, and you'd be able to pipe those back and forth between Windows and Linux. So I'm running out of time here, but the last two things that I'd really like to show you is I use VS Code a lot, right? And the reason why I do is because it's really easy to use, and I really find it a great tool. So if I'm actually working inside of multiple instances of Linux and Windows, you don't have to really type anything or open up different instances of VS Code. All you need to do is type code, okay? And that'll actually launch a specific instance of VS Code just for the distribution that you're in. You'll see it automatically opens up into my WSL Ubuntu instance. Okay, and I can go in and I can edit this just like I could if I was running, VS Code from, a Windows instance. If I type code here, okay, that's going to launch going right into System 32, and I'll be able to edit from there. Notice it also adds all the different extensions and everything I have, because I have that on the Windows side. I don't have it on the Linux side. Okay, and those settings aren't shared yet. I think they're getting to that point, but they're not shared yet. And the last thing I want to talk to you about is actually interoperability with Docker. So I don't know if you work with Docker or Kubernetes, but if you work with Docker Desktop, you can now, with Docker Desktop, you can enable Kubernetes. I don't know if you knew that, but it's really kind of cool. And I work with both. I love working with individual Docker containers, and I love working with Kubernetes clusters and K8s and K3s. And when you run the Docker Desktop, if you bring up your icon and you right-click on your Docker Desktop, which I, for some reason, don't have running, but I'm going to start it up real quick. If you start it up and you right-click on it and you open up your settings, when you do the install, it asks you, hey, you got WSL2 installed. Do you want us to integrate with that? And that's exactly what this setting is here. Use the WSL2 based engine. Okay. When you click on Resources, you'll notice a WSL integration option here. Notice that it's enabling integration with my default WSL distro, but all of these are unchecked. So if I go out to my Debian instance right now, I'm going to clear the screen here, and I were to type in the command Docker. Docker not found. Sorry, can't do it. Can't help you. Don't know what that is. Come back soon when you know what you really need. So what I need to do here is I need to say, okay, Debian, I want that to be integrated. Apply and restart. Only takes a few seconds. We go back to Debian. We run the same command, the Docker command. And now I have the full Docker ability that I have, because it's actually working with the Docker desktop that's running on the Windows side. Now I'm going to show a quick example that I'm actually running Docker, and that it will, a container will actually run. And this isn't all just smoke and mirrors that I'm showing you here. This command will actually go out and run a cool little container. As you can see, it's going out and pulling the containers, and it runs a little clippy, and it says, hey, the Data Platform Summit rocks. Yahoo! We've just run a Docker container. And we can do this again and make it a little bit more colorful, where I'm going to actually run it, and it's going to show this after it loads here. I didn't have these preloaded. But after the container loads, it will actually show a really cool aquarium, okay, with a bunch of fish going across it. But I did this to prove a point, is that I'm actually utilizing the features of Docker Desktop in the Windows side from Linux. I don't have to install Docker on Linux. You can install Docker on Linux, but you don't have to. Now, there may be reasons you want to, okay, and that complete integration, there's your aquarium, by the way. The complete integration for Docker on Linux from the WSL standpoint still isn't like fully baked, all right? They still have some, things that they're coming out with, but there are some workarounds that people have exposed to be able to do that. But I've really never had to do that, because I can do it all from Windows. I can run all of that, via the WSL or directly in Windows Docker. So with that, I would like to say thank you very much for attending this session. As you mentioned before, I hope you really enjoyed it. I hope you learned something from it, dealing with the Windows terminal, the WSL, and having a little bit of fun with all of that in PowerShell. You can always reach me on Twitter at MikeNelsonIO. Go out and check out my GitHub at MikeNelson-IO. And once again, thank you, Data Platform, for having me. And I hope everyone has a fantastic and safe evening, morning, or afternoon, wherever you are.